This episode in the tuning series is sponsored by Midwest Megasquirt. More on them later in the video. Corn. Does your car get enough? Are you sadly deficient in the vitamin C and lack power because of it? Today, we're talking, of course, about ethanol, E85, flex fuel, massa de la vroom vroom, and what it can do for you. While it's made from a variety of sources, corn is probably the most common, and ethanol made from it is then blended with normal gasoline to produce a fuel that can do amazing things. Today, we'll be covering the basics of E85, what makes it such a great fuel for performance and how it's different from gasoline, what supporting mods are needed, all the ways to configure and tune E85 in Tuner Studio and Megasquirt. And to make it easier, I will leave time codes in the description below for each section. So why is E85 considered a performance fuel? First, it has a higher octane, which allows more timing and not being knock limited like most engines on regular gasoline. The octane is well above 100, up to 109 in some blends. Second, you can jam more fuel in there. More fuel, more power. You may have heard that you need to add a lot more fuel because E85 has less energy density than straight gasoline. Well, that's correct, but don't think of it as you have to. Think of it as you get to. E85 requires about 9.8 parts of air to 1 part of fuel, whereas gasoline requires 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. By weight, ethanol is 30% oxygen. So the chemical formula is C2, which is carbon, H6, which is hydrogen, and an oxygen. While gasoline is a blend of a number of chemicals, the primary one is a mixture of light hydrocarbons in the C4 to C12 range. So you've got the C4, carbon 12s with associated hydrogens attached to them and no oxygen at all. Now, gasoline is blended with a bunch of other things like octane, isooctane, and some other additives and whatnot. So there's not one single formula for gasoline, but basically it's a mixture of hydrocarbons. Finally, ethanol vaporizes while gasoline atomizes. Those are two different things. And while gasoline does vaporize a little bit, it's nowhere near the level that ethanol does. So when an injector sprays out the small droplets of gasoline, that's exactly what it is, droplets. But ethanol, on the other hand, comes out as droplets and almost immediately converts to gas. You may have heard that ethanol burns cooler, and it may slightly, but what really happens is that the fuel vaporizes very quickly, and this change from a liquid to a gas pulls the heat from the combustion chamber. So that's a great feature when you're looking for power. The low vapor point has the effect of speeding up the burn rate. Ethanol fuel burns more quickly and releases the energy faster than gasoline. This property matters a lot, and we'll come back to it when we get into the tuning. However, this vaporization point falls dramatically when the temperature drops. Below about 10 C or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, it becomes harder to ignite, which is why you hear about people having problems with cold starts on ethanol fuels, which is why winter blends of E85 actually drop the ethanol content to E70 or even lower. You need to be able to add more fuel, so that means fuel system upgrades. You may need a larger fuel pump and injectors. In addition, ethanol is much more corrosive than gasoline and can cause problems with traditional fuel systems that are not rated for it. I have videos in my fuel series where I upgrade the pump, injectors, fuel lines, and install a flex fuel sensor. I'll leave a link up above. We'll talk more about the flex fuel sensor in a moment. At a minimum, you'll also need a wideband O2 sensor and a standalone ECU like the Megasquirt or a fully reflashable OEM ECU for more modern cars. Before diving into Tuner Studio, let's talk about our approach. To take full advantage, we need to change some things related to the fueling and the timing. There are many ways to do this, and this is where people get really confused. Fueling refers to not only your main fuel VE map, but also to cranking, warm-up, and accelerant enrichment, among others. Tuning ignition means anywhere the engine was knock limited on gasoline, we want to advance the timing to take advantage of our high knock resistance of the fuel. But this does not mean advancing the timing everywhere. If you are not knock limited, then advancing the timing will cost you power and just waste fuel. Remember how I said ethanol burns faster than gasoline? That means we may need to retard timing in some areas of the map. Igniting the mixture too soon causes max burn pressure in the cylinder to be reached too early before it coincides with the compression of the piston. Most engines want the max force to apply about 10 to 15 degrees after the top of the stroke while it's on its way down in the power stroke. Okay, so we know we need to tune spark and add fuel. E85 has a whole different air-fuel ratio range compared to gasoline though, right? E85 is about 9.8 stoichiometric complete combustion versus gas is 14.7. So we need to change all our targets and default to point to the new range, right? No, God, no, do not do this. I think this confuses people the most and makes their tuning process way more complicated than it needs to be. Here is the secret. All widebands output values in Lambda. Lambda is simply a calculation based on combustion regardless of fuel. It outputs the same number for stoichiometric regardless of whether it's gasoline, ethanol, methanol, natural gas, anything. 1.0 means complete combustion, no oxygen left, or stoichiometric, regardless. Greater than 1.0 is lean, less than 1.0 is rich. Your gauge and controller then convert this to the typical gasoline AFR for display purposes. There's no reason to change anything about your gauge, your sensor, or even your AFR targets in your tune. If your brain thinks in gas AFRs, not Lambda values, then feel free to continue to do that. For the most part, AFR targets used for gasoline can be used without problem for E85. There are a couple places that E85 may give more power at slightly leaner AFR, and we'll get to that. But you'd have to adjust this regardless of whether you're using gas AFRs, ethanol AFRs, or Lambda. The AFRs are just a display. So for now, don't change anything. Ways to convert to E85 in Tuner Studio. Here's where the internet gets really annoying. In addition to telling you must convert your AFRs to ethanol, change your tune, they will also give you a lot of different ways to set up E85. I'm going to cover all the main ones I've seen out there and what the pros and cons are for each one. Which brings us to today's sponsor, Midwest Megasquirt. If you want to dive into the world of fully tunable EFI systems, there's no better partner than Midwest Megasquirt. They offer not only highly respected Megasquirt ECUs at a variety of price points for many vehicle platforms, but also their years of experience in racing and making big power. They even do professional installs of their products and can help guide you on your builds. From turbos to superchargers to nitrous and even old school carburetor builds, the guys at Midwest Megasquirt have seen it all. Get unbeatable performance today at MidwestMegasquirt.com. So before we talk about what to do, let's talk about what not to do. So what I told you before is that your O2 sensor is going to output Lambda and that there's no reason to change your stoichiometric AFR. For instance, like in this tune, they went ahead and changed it to 9.8 because they thought that that's what it should be because they're running ethanol. Well, what is actually happening is the number is going to come in as Lambda to Tuner Studio and it's going to be converted to whichever AFR you want. And so there's no reason to change everything unless you really want to. So you can leave this at the normal 14.7, or sometimes I put 0.6 because most gasoline blends in the US are up to 10% ethanol, so you go a little bit less, and we just leave it at that. Level 1. So the next most common thing I see is that people say, oh, you just need to multiply your fuel table, which you can do just by selecting it, by the number that's based on the energy density of the fuel that you're running. So if you're running E85, then you're going to want to multiply this times like 1.35, maybe 1.4 to raise it by 140%, and that offsets your energy density of the E85 fuel, and you're done, right? That sounds pretty simple. The problem with this is that there are several places that need to have more fuel. Basically any calculation regarding fuel delivery. So all those places need to be multiplied, and not just that, retuned. We're talking about cranking, warm up, Excel enrichment, all kinds of places. So that's why this method is not ideal. While technically this will run and drive, it may not start especially if it's a cold day. Level 2. So I see this from people who know a little bit more about Tuner Studio, and they realize that just changing your fuel VE table is not going to fix everything in one go. And so they think, hey, an easy thing that can be done is to simply change your required fuel. So this is a setting that's calculated. This number affects basically your VE table, and it's really affecting the pulse width of how long the injectors are actually open to deliver fuel. So by clicking here, you get this calculator screen, and that's all this is. This is not used by the tuning software beyond this, just to calculate this number. Once this is calculated, it's just a number in this field. So changing the air-fuel ratio here to say 9.8 will change this number from 4.9 to 7.2, which is about 150% increase, multiplying it like by 1.5. So yes, this can kill several birds with one simple change. It will affect the cranking and nacelle enrichment and the various other things that I mentioned before. So this is the one place that you can modify your air-fuel ratio and have it mostly be okay, that you don't need to change anything else, because this, on this screen, air-fuel ratio is just part of a calculation. It's not used otherwise. It's the other screen that controls how the air-fuel ratio is used to control fueling dynamically. Two problems though. If you're converting to E85 and will never switch back, this may be an option. If you plan to switch back and forth, don't do this. You'll be constantly tweaking your tables, and it'll never feel quite dialed in like it did on one fuel type. Second, E85 is not E85. The ethanol content varies wildly, and I mean wildly, between stations and over the course of the year, especially in places that experience freezing temperatures. This is because E85 sucks in the cold, and they add more gasoline to it as a winter blend. So this option, while overall is super easy, it's still not ideal. So if you really want to run E85 and you want to do it like the OEMs, you need a flex fuel sensor. That's how the OEMs manage to deal with all these changing conditions, different fuels, different places, different temperatures, and it all seems to work magically. That's how they do it. So if you want to be like them, you need one of these sensors, and you can do it, and it's not very expensive. Which brings us to level 3, fuel multiplier percent. So what is that? Well, if you come in here to the fuel sensor settings screen, this will be a screen that you're familiar with if you've already installed a flex fuel sensor, which I highly recommend. Go back and check out the video on that. But this tells what kind of flex fuel sensor you have, what the input is, and for a normal GM sensor, which most people are using, it has a frequency of 50 to 150 hertz, and that tells it that it's going to be an ethanol mix of 0% to 100% ethanol. And by default, you have this fuel multiplier in here that says if it's at 100% gasoline, no ethanol, then just use the table as is. However, if it's at 100% ethanol on the other end of the scale, multiply this table by 163%. So it's going to add this to your fueling here to make it run on E100. We're going to be doing E85, but that's fine. It's going to do it automatically based on the content of the fuel itself, based on what the sensor is telling it. So it'll probably multiply it by 150, 155 or so, based on the fuel that's coming in at that moment. All right, so this is awesome, right? That solves our problem. We're taking account of the ethanol that's actually coming into the system. Well, sort of. This only deals with fueling. As I said before, ignition timing is a huge part of the equation. You're going to be leaving a lot of power on the table if you don't also tweak your ignition timing, and based on the ethanol content, your ignition timing needs to change as well, either up or down. So to fix this problem, you need to have more than one table. And you may need to have more than one table for both fuel, spark, and others in your system. Now, unfortunately, if you're on a Megasquirt 2 or earlier, your journey may be at an end. This may be sort of the limit of what you can do with that particular firmware. A really great way to have your cake and eat it too is to have one table perfectly tuned for gasoline and one table perfectly tuned for E85, and then blend between them based on the actual ethanol content that's being read by the flex fuel sensor that you have installed. Now, there are two ways to do this in Tuner Studio: dual fuel in the flex blend mode, or by using straight up table switching. Let's talk flex blend. Coming up here to table choices and table switch, dual fuel screen. We've got these two columns. So for now, we're going to ignore table switching. We'll get to this. But we're going to come over here to dual fuel enable and turn it on. And by default, it'll go into flex blend. It has a couple different options, but that's the one we want. And what it's going to do is it's going to show, now it's not grayed out, these different alternate tables. And indeed, once we turn that on, you will now see something new. You've got your Fuel VE table 1 and your Fuel VE table 3. So these are two main tables. And maybe a small digression here. You have four tables. So Fuel VE table 1 is your main table. Table 2 is used as a trim table. So if you have trimming enabled, this will show up. VE table 2 is your secondary table, with table 4 being your trim table for 3. So it comes in pairs, 1 and 2, 3 and 4. Also, depending on your version of Tuner Studio and the version of your firmware, you may be able to actually auto-tune on VE table 3 directly. However, depending on certain things, it may not work. So I'll show you a workaround that does work for everybody, in which we export the table that we want to tune on back into table 1, we do our street tuning, we save a copy, and we put it into 3. Very simple. All right, so let's get our VE table 3 set up. That'll be our full ethanol table, E85 table. And if we look at it, it may have some default values in it. Obviously, this looks a little weird, so we don't care about what is in there right now. What we care about is our presumably tuned gasoline table, which we're going to save out. So we're going to export the table, and we're going to call it, that's fine, close. And then we're going to open up our VE table 3, and we'll go to import, and this is the other one. And it's going to pop in everything. So this has got all the our same scale. That'll come across as well. So we're set up the same way, and everything is good. So now we've got our two tables set up, but they're identical. So how is that going to help anything, right? Well, keep in mind that we still have our flex fuel multiplier set up over here. So what it's going to do is, based on the table that we just loaded into VE3, it's going to be multiplying that times the actual content, and then it's going to be using the blend curve to blend between them. So technically, you don't have to change your VE table 3 to be higher in values and have it blend, because that's what this is for. It's already going to multiply it out. Now, option 2 here is to set your fuel multiplier here to 100 so that it doesn't do that. In which case, you'll need to go into your VE table 3 and modify it manually like we did at level 1. So this is basically just a preference type of thing. If you're kind of OCD and you want to see higher numbers in the table 3 because you know you should be having more fuel, and you don't want to have to always think to yourself, oh yeah, it's also being multiplied by that fuel multiplier, then feel free to do it this way. You can multiply this times the same amount as your fuel multiplier, and it'll be basically good to go. And then you can street tune on this as well. And then Or you can just leave it as is and leave your fuel multiplier alone and have it multiply automatically. Personally, I like to use the fuel multiplier and just copy VE1 as is to VE3, and then you can actually tune on VE3. By setting up our auto tune here, we can switch to our different table and start auto tuning. Presumably at this point we would be running E85 as is in the tank. It's not blended with some old gasoline or something. You've been through maybe a couple tanks worth of fuel to make sure that the E85 content is high, and it should be telling you on your gauge that what your E85, your ethanol percentage actually is. So that should be high at 85% or so. And then you can go through your tuning here and make any tweaks as necessary. Now, what's going to happen is, as you do tweaks to this, in a way, this is going to start to look like a trim table. So your number actually may go lower than what it was before. And the reason is because it's multiplying by that percentage, 150 or so or whatever. And you may want to go less than that. You may want to have it be only 135% right here, or especially down here in cruise or something like that. And so this goes lower, which may really blow your mind, but it's fine. Keep in mind, you can think of it more like a trim table if you want to, if that makes it clear in your head. So either way is fine. You can either multiply this and turn off your fuel multiplier, or leave the fuel multiplier as is, which is at 163 for pure ethanol, and have it multiply in the background, and sort of think of this as a trim table. So now you potentially have two tables to use for your various things, especially fuel, that you can turn on or off. Now, how does it work to blend between the two? Well, you have a new thing that's showed up called your blend curve. In the default flex blend mode, you have a single curve that blends all the alternate tables you have set up. So this is a very simple way of doing it. It uses the same curve to deal with not only fuel, but spark, AFR, warm up, any of these things that you've enabled. And it looks like this. So based on the blend percentage, so what the flex fuel sensor is giving, you can set up your percentages of how you want to blend between the two tables here using this chart or table. And so ideally it's kind of a 45-degree line that extends out. You want to be 100%. You see it ends earlier here at E85. So you want to be on, if you're on E85, you want to be at 100% the secondary table. And if you're on, say, E10 down here, you want to be 100% on your gasoline table. So just that simple. You don't need to tweak this too much usually, and by keeping it to one blending curve, you can tweak all the things, all the different alternate tables that you may have set up at once. Okay, boss mode. So we've turned on some things, but you'll see that most of these things are off. If you want the ultimate in control, you can start cranking through these and turning them on. And not only that, you can set up table switching for some of them. And what that does is it enables different blends. If you need it to blend in a different way based on what you're blending, then you have that control. So realistically, I recommend doing this in stages. When you're tuning your car, there's really no reason to turn all this on at once at the beginning and complicate everything. Because a lot of times your single blend curve is going to work fine. You can have like the same table for AFR, for example, especially at the beginning, and you really don't need the rest of this stuff. Maybe you need warm up, but maybe your after start is fine. Your cranking pulse is maybe fine as well. It starts just fine, but it kind of stumbles right after it catches. So in that case, you need your warm-up or after start, maybe one or both. But you may not need everything else. You may not need anything with overboost, or even accel enrichment may be fine for you. So in those cases, just leave them off. So I recommend hitting each one of these one at a time. So what's the difference between turning these on this side versus this side? So if I turn off this for fuel table, it will turn on fuel table switching over here. And so what that means is, or it'll enable it, and then I can turn it on if I want. And it gives me some options here. So it's always going to be hardware, and you'll see that it enables blend curve 3. Now there are other input pins that can happen, but when we're doing flex fuel like this, that's what we want, blend curve 3. So when we come over here, we see this enabled. So we look at blend curve 3, and this is the curve similar to 8, which we can set up exactly like 8 if we'd like. And what you want to make sure on these blend curves is that you're using the right thing to curve on, which is your flex percentage. You can set up these switch tables, like I said before, on pretty much anything. It can be set up by gear, it can be set up by vehicle speed. There's all kinds of things that you can set up, any kind of custom sensor that you've added. That can be used to control how you blend between 1 and 3. But in this case, we're going to use the flex percent. So by doing this, we have control over fueling separately from everything else. So for fueling, for example, in this case, we can use blend curve 3. And if we turn on other things like spark and AFR or something, then we can use our standard blend curve 8 to control those. So this makes it easy. You have one blend curve for things that work fine with one blend curve, and then when you really want to dial it in and be very specific, you can have separate blend curves. So if I turn this off again, I can go over here to spark, turn that on, and now I get blend curve 4. So you'll see that now that is enabled. Again, you go in here and you want to make sure that it's set up to flex, and then you're good. And you can tweak that curve as well. Okay, we've covered the theory and the screens. So in the next video, we'll put my recommended process into action on a car. Turn on dual fuel flex blend. Turn on alt fuel tables, and we'll use curve 8. Leave other alt tables off for now. Export VE1 and import it into VE3. Go to Auto Tune, select VE3. Empty the tank and fill with E85 as high as you can get. And then we're going to street tune. Set up ignition table 2 and tune timing now. Set up the alternate tables for warm-up, after start, accel enrichment as needed. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell to know instantly when the next video is released. See you next time, and thanks again to Midwest Megasquirt. Check them out on the web or Instagram, links below.